Story 1.
The manager of the Hombre Lobo bar restaurant was a tall, broad-shouldered, muscular man with a tanned complexion. He sported a neatly trimmed beard and mustache, and his long black hair was tied back in a bun. He was dressed in a white three-piece suit, clearly modeling himself after the fashion of the 1940s or 1950s, with a retro style that Leticia found appealing. In fact, she liked everything about Hombre Lobo so far. Your shifts will be on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. If you prove yourself, we'll put you on weekends when we get more guests and tips. Pedro, our junior maitre d', will show you the ropes. Best of luck, Señorita Leticia. With those words, the manager stood up easily, signaling the conversation was over. Pedro, it turned out, was a charming, blue-eyed brunette around 25. At the moment, he was busy handling some complicated arrangements for a large group in the VIP area, and suggested Leticia take a walk around the restaurant on her own. Like someone enchanted, Leticia wandered through the cavern that someone's wild imagination had transformed into the most fantastic restaurant in the world. The naturally formed underground landscape, with its countless stalactites and stalagmites, had been preserved in its original state, only enhanced by whimsical lighting. Blue, green, red. The lighting shifted occasionally, giving the interior a dramatic flair, much like a spotlight in a modern theater changing from blue to crimson, hinting at an approaching climax. The bar shone the brightest, bathed in steady golden light, while the cozy tables for two, tucked into the natural alcoves, were almost swallowed by the dim lighting. Leticia suddenly wished she could be assigned to one of these romantic little tables, but Pedro, having finally finished with the previous guests and seating the new ones, led her to the third gallery, the one that ended near the service areas. These two stuffy little rooms for small groups are yours. Yeah, not many guests come here on weekdays, Pedro admitted. But if you kiss me, I might send a few your way. Get lost. Leticia laughed, and they both chuckled. And so her first day at Hombre Lobo began, a job she had found by chance through a Facebook ad. By the end of her first week, Leticia had settled in well and met most of the staff, except for those whose shifts never seemed to coincide with hers. As is common for newcomers, mistakes were inevitable. On Friday, the head maitre d' brought a pair of foreigners to one of the stuffy rooms, a stocky red-haired man with a beard and a tall, dark-haired woman. While the man asked Leticia whether foie gras was available and how long it would take to prepare, the woman fidgeted on the bench, twitching as if she had been seated on nails, and finally, in a sharp, unpleasant voice, almost shouted, "Let's get out of here! I can't stay here. How can you work in a place like this?" She suddenly directed her ire at Leticia. "Don't you understand where you are?" The strange couple left without ordering anything, and Leticia wasn't able to stop them. Not that she tried. She was too stunned. Incidents like these were supposed to be reported to the maitre d', and Leticia braced herself for a scolding or even being fired, but nothing came of it. Seizing the opportunity, she asked Manuela, the girl she'd grown closest to, what that outburst could have meant. What did she mean? There's not some shady side to this place, is there? You know, drugs or girls? Leticia asked cautiously. No, not at all. This place is clean. That woman was just nuts, Manuela replied. Manuela was also Leticia's partner during her first official shift, and Leticia was glad to have her company. But Pedro surprised her. He didn't have to stay for an extra hour, let alone drive the girls home afterward. After dropping off Manuela, Pedro spoke at length with Leticia on their way to her house, chatting about various topics, like how he had a degree in public relations, but had to work in a different field. Occasionally, he still got to use his PR skills. like when the manager asked him to monitor what people were saying about Hombre Lobo online. "And what do they say?" Leticia asked to keep the conversation going. "Mostly the truth. But writers love a good, sensational story. Sometimes they even say that if you drink enough here, you might see demons." Leticia burst out laughing. Pedro took her laughter as encouragement and slid his free hand under her dress. She instantly and sharply slapped the offending hand, and it retreated. Luckily, the car was stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the green light. Pedro jerked quite noticeably, and Leticia realized he was far more nervous than he appeared. "Sorry," he muttered. "It's fine, but just so you know, on the off chance it matters, I'm not sure if I'll get married as a virgin, but I'd like to. And because of that—" "I understand," Pedro said. Was there joy in his voice? Or was she imagining it? Anything seemed possible at such a late hour, and it would be easy to misinterpret things. In any case, she cared about what he thought of her, and despite her exhaustion, she tossed and turned for a long time that night, replaying their conversation in her mind. On Saturday, Leticia met up with her friends. Their group took up a large table on the restaurant's veranda overlooking the ocean. A crowd had gathered, 12 people, which made Leticia the 13th. This immediately gave rise to jokes. The mood was high, with the conversation constantly interrupted by bursts of laughter, the guys cracking jokes, and the girls flirting and making witty remarks. "Hey, Letty, aren't you scared to go down into your cave?" Paco asked. "Terrified. They say there are demons or wild dogs down there." Everyone at the table roared with laughter. "I'm not talking about urban legends. You know a girl disappeared down there, right?" "You're kidding." "No, really. I read about it a long time ago. Every waitress that's worked at Hombre Lobo has gone missing." "All of them at once, or one by one?" "You laugh, but I distinctly remember. The article was about a girl who disappeared back in the 90s. "And where did you read that?" "I want to read it too," Isabel chimed in. Eventually, it turned out that Paco had read the sensational article 7 or 8 years ago in some magazine he found on a bus. The group found this so amusing that they laughed for at least 3 minutes. "Come on, Paco, admit it. You made that up to scare me," Leticia said after the laughter died down. "No, really, it happened." A heated debate ensued, one of those arguments that start when everyone's had a bit too much to drink. People pulled out their phones, but the internet had no record of any missing girl from Hombre Lobo. Eventually, Paco and Leticia made a bet for a bottle of champagne. An odd bet that could only come from inebriated minds. If Leticia found any article about a missing waitress from Hombre Lobo, Paco would treat everyone to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town. On Tuesday, Leticia went straight to the university library after breakfast. The periodical's reading room stayed open even during the summer, and Senora Martinez, a sharp, intelligent woman with short, graying hair and keen black eyes, was on duty. Leticia reintroduced herself and reminded Senora Martinez which department she was from. The older woman remembered her. "I realize this might sound like a wild goose chase, but I'm looking for an article about a waitress who disappeared from Hombre Lobo in the 1990s. "Let's start with El Testigo then," Senora Martinez suggested. "It was a magazine that came out every 2 weeks from 1989 to the early 2000s and focused exclusively on crime and investigations." Senora Martinez brought out the first volume of El Testigo, and Leticia dived into reading. The day passed quickly and fruitlessly, with only a short break for lunch. Nothing. 10 minutes before the library was due to close, Leticia started flipping through the 1995 volume, skimming only the tables of contents. "Witness hangs himself in prison cell." Shock. Mother sells son for organs. As she hurriedly turned a page, she accidentally creased one of them and paused to smooth it out. That's when her eyes caught the words Hombre Lobo. A bus driver was suspected of murdering one Ana Maria Solitado, who disappeared without a trace on August 10th, 1995, and had been working part-time as a waitress at the Hombre Lobo bar restaurant. After convincing the kind Senora Martinez to stay a little longer, Leticia photographed all 8 articles about the missing Ana Maria from the 1995 and 1996 issues of El Testigo. The story was forgotten after that. Senora Martinez promised to look for more information in other publications by Thursday, and at 8:30, Leticia finally left the cool walls of the library. On the bus, she managed to get a seat, so she started reading on the way home. By the time she arrived, she had already pieced together a clear picture of what had happened 21 years ago. Ana Maria was the eldest daughter in a large, modest, but respectable family. She was studying social work in college and working as a waitress during the summer. She had only worked at the restaurant for a month. On the morning of August 10th, she left home at 8 a.m. and walked to the bus stop with a neighbor who was going to visit relatives. Around 8:15, the girls boarded bus hash 219, driven by Enrique Gomez, a 36-year-old man who had once been convicted of aggravated assault. The neighbor got off halfway, while Ana Maria stayed on the bus until the final stop, the beach. According to Gomez, all the passengers, including a short girl in a white blouse and light blue pants, got off at the beach. But Ana Maria never showed up at Hombre Lobo, which was a 10-minute walk from the stop. She was never seen again, neither alive nor dead. The police managed to find several passengers who had been on the bus with Ana Maria, but none of them could remember exactly where she got off, or if she even did. Questioning the staff and management of Hombre Lobo also yielded no results. It seemed they were telling the truth, and Ana Maria had never made it to work that day. The missing girl was known for her calm and friendly nature, and she had no enemies or bad habits. She didn't have a lover either, according to her family. Ana Maria was still a virgin. It wasn't surprising that the investigation settled on the version that explained everything and seemed plausible. Ana Maria had been sitting in a seat just behind the driver's cab, so Gomez could easily see her in the mirror. The modest appearance of the attractive girl had likely stirred his darkest instincts, and when the bus reached the final stop, Gomez had found some excuse to delay Ana Maria, entered the bus, and knocked her unconscious. He then drove the bus to a parking lot where no one could interrupt him, re-entered the bus, and raped and killed her, probably by strangulation. He hid her body in a sack, carried it out and stashed it somewhere, though where exactly, the investigation was unable to determine, returned to the bus, picked up passengers at the beach stop, and continued his route as if nothing had happened, driving all day until the last route at 10:35 p.m. Under the cover of night, Gomez retrieved Ana Maria's body from the hiding place, went to the beach, took someone's boat, rowed far enough from the shore, and dumped the body into the ocean, where it was carried away by the tide. The version was very convincing, but Gomez flatly refused to confess. Not even torture made him admit to anything. A human rights organization, Justice and Rights, got wind of the illegal measures used on the suspect and caused an uproar, but none of that mattered to Leticia. The important thing was that Gomez remained a suspect, but was never formally charged, and the case remained unsolved. In El Testigo, Leticia found photographs of both the victim and her suspected killer. Gomez was a sullen, dark-haired man with heavy features. Ana Maria bore a slight resemblance to Leticia herself. if you disregarded the voluminous bangs that were fashionable in those days and imagined her lips a bit fuller. Leticia didn't like the resemblance one bit. The next morning, when she got off her bus at the same beach stop, she was overcome with a strange feeling. What had happened here 21 years ago, long before she was born? Did Gomez really kill Ana Maria, or was he falsely accused? Around Leticia, groups and couples were happily heading toward the beach, laughter echoing in the air. This place could hardly be called deserted. The bus lot was just across the road, with minibuses constantly arriving with tourists. Okay, maybe Gomez knew the security guard, and he allowed the bus to park there for a few minutes for free. But how did Gomez manage to carry out the body in a sack without being seen? And where did he hide it? Leticia's curiosity got the better of her, and she crossed the highway to examine the lot, fenced off with wire mesh. Was this fence here 20 years ago? If it was, Gomez couldn't have carried the body out unnoticed, and where could he have hidden it? There were no bushes or abandoned buildings nearby. He couldn't have gone far. He had another route to run. And even if he had found some now non-existent shrubs, after 12 hours in the heat, the body would have started to decompose and emit a strong odor. Maybe Gomez wasn't a saint, but it seemed unlikely that he killed Ana Maria. Having reached this conclusion, Leticia hurried to the restaurant, evaluating the path for the first time in terms of safety. 7/8 of the road ran along the beach, and only the last stretch, which passed by tall trees, seemed like it could pose some threat. Someone could easily hide behind a tree, waiting for a victim. Leticia. Although the voice that called her was familiar, she couldn't help but flinch. Pedro appeared suddenly beside her, as if materializing from the already warm morning air. "How are you feeling? You look a little worried." "I'm fine." "So, how about dinner tonight?" "Tonight?" "Are you busy?" "Not really. We could have dinner." As they approached the restaurant's parking lot, Leticia noticed a small blue structure nestled in the shade of tall trees just beyond the lot. She'd walked past it countless times without paying attention, but now she noticed it and asked Pedro what it was. "An old shed, I think. I've never been in there. It's got a big padlock on the door." Squinting and shading her eyes with her hand, Leticia indeed spotted a large padlock hanging on the door. Was the door locked 21 years ago? Or had the real killer intercepted Ana Maria on her way, just like Pedro had intercepted Leticia, and lured her into that shed where he murdered her? If that were true, it would explain why the rest of the Hombre Lobo staff told the truth. They never saw Ana Maria, because she never made it the last 20 meters to the bar restaurant. And afterward, the killer moved the body. But if no one noticed his actions, if he moved around the property without drawing attention, then the killer had to have been an employee of the restaurant, and Ana Maria must have trusted him. "Hey," she interrupted Pedro, who had been talking about something else. "Who's worked at Hombre Lobo the longest?" "The manager," Pedro replied without hesitation. "Why?" "Just curious." "How long has he been working there?" "Exactly 20 years. He's mentioned it himself. 20? Not 21? By then, they had entered the restaurant, and the conversation naturally came to an end. Leticia planned to pick it up again over dinner, but it didn't happen. Pedro behaved impeccably. He was just the right amount of playful, the right amount of gallant, and gazed at her with such smitten eyes that Leticia couldn't say his look didn't affect her at all. She wasn't in love yet, but maybe she would be tomorrow, or the day after, or in a month. You know, my birthday's in 2 weeks, on the 18th. I don't usually celebrate it, but this year, I'd like to spend it with you." "We'll see," Leticia smiled. "There's still plenty of time." The next day, she really didn't want to go to the library, but the desire not to damage her reputation in the eyes of Senora Martinez, whom she greatly respected, forced Leticia to board the bus and follow her familiar route. The librarian had prepared a stack of publications, marking the relevant issues with bookmarks, and Leticia had no choice but to immerse herself once again in the sad story of Ana Maria. She didn't learn anything fundamentally new. The articles mostly repeated one another, except for a note in some tabloid that mentioned a certain Rosita Castro, who had disappeared in August 1988, exactly 7 years before Ana Maria. If the author of the note, who modestly signed with initials, was to be believed, Rosita had also worked at Hombre Lobo. Leticia felt a strange sensation. She suddenly didn't want to dig any further into this, as if the investigation held something heavy and unpleasant for her personally, as if the truth was painful. And yet, Leticia asked Senora Martinez to bring her the newspapers from August 1988. There was less written about Rosita Castro than about Ana Maria, perhaps because she was just a farm girl who had come to the city to find work. At Hombre Lobo, she had worked as a cleaner but had either quit or been fired 3 weeks before she disappeared. On the morning of August 27th, according to the girl with whom Rosita shared a room, she went to visit relatives in a village and vanished without a trace. Again, no leads, no jealous lover, no clear enemies. People who knew Rosita described her as a modest, very religious girl. She didn't wear makeup or drink wine. She was only 18 years old. The case of Rosita Castro's disappearance had been filed away as unsolved. So what? Every year, thousands of people go missing in Mexico, many of them young women. Why did these 2 cases affect Leticia so deeply? Was it because of the restaurant? But Rosita hadn't been working there at the time of her disappearance. Could it have been a coincidence? Or rather, what were the chances of such a coincidence? On the other hand, even if Hombre Lobo had employed a serial killer, it happened 2 decades ago. Maybe he had already died if he hadn't been young at the time. When she searched online for information about the missing waitress from Hombre Lobo, she found nothing, meaning that for the past, however many years, no one had gone missing. All of this was tragic, but it was in the past and had no connection to the present. Or did it? There was only one person who could provide an answer to that question, her older sister, Luz, an attorney. Luckily, Luz was flying in from the States tomorrow. Luz looked cheerful and well-rested, and some of her mood rubbed off on Leticia. Her sister listened attentively, without interrupting or making fun of her. Perhaps some of that attentiveness came from her professional training as a lawyer. But regardless, Leticia was grateful for her willingness to dig into the situation. After hearing everything, Luz quietly smoked a cigarette, then calmly and methodically broke everything down, so much so that Leticia felt a weight lift from her chest. The fact that the missing girls worked at that restaurant doesn't mean their disappearance is connected to it. Moreover, I'm not even sure they were killed. At least, not immediately. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a gang led by a man named Nunez operated in the city and the surrounding areas. They specialized in human trafficking. Among other things, they kidnapped young, attractive women and sold them into underground brothels. Do you know how they lured their victims? The gang had a woman with a large belly, like she was pregnant. She would approach the victim on the street and ask for help getting home, saying she felt unwell. Naturally, the girls sympathized with the pregnant woman and would walk with her to a place where the gang's thugs were waiting with a car. Most likely, both girls fell into Nunez's hands or into the hands of another criminal group. I doubt Hombre Lobo had anything to do with it. But, I've told you before, and I'll say it again. I don't think you should be working in that bar, or in any bar. In your case, side jobs only make sense if they're related to your field. But it's your life and your choice. Leticia headed home with her hands full. Along with the gifts Luz had brought from the States, she handed her a book with a promising title. Vanished Without a Trace. The Problem of Disappearances in Mexico and the Work of Law Enforcement. Luz knew the author personally and assured her it was one of the best works written on the subject in recent years. Leticia promised to read it, but on Sunday she had plans with friends and got home late. Then on Monday she got a surprise. The manager called Leticia into his office and told her that he was very pleased with her work, was giving her a raise, and promoting her to the most prestigious tables in the VIP area. "I'm very grateful," Leticia said, a bit flustered. "But you probably remember that I'm only working here temporarily, just until the end of summer." "We value our employees, whether they're with us temporarily or permanently," the manager responded with dignity. "And yes, you can choose your shifts. Just coordinate with Pedro." Out of curiosity, she asked to be scheduled for Wednesday and the weekends when, according to the other waiters, the tips could be fantastic. Pedro congratulated her on her first success, as cheerful and pleasant as ever, and suggested they celebrate somewhere. Pedro was busy on Monday, so they agreed to meet on Tuesday, his day off. They met at the entrance to a beach, not the large one that stretched along Hombre Lobo, but a smaller, private one with beautiful tropical-style canopies and cozy lounge chairs. Under each canopy stood 2 lounge chairs covered with bright red and white fabric. They lay down next to each other, and both naturally checked out the other's figure. A pleasant discovery for Leticia was that Pedro's body was just as impressive as her own. Straight, strong legs, toned abs, and well-defined arm muscles. He really was a good-looking guy. No denying that. After a while, their conversation predictably shifted to Hombre Lobo. "Yeah, I'm always smiling, always in shape, but I'm so tired of it all. I've been working at Hombre Lobo for 5 years. After college, I couldn't find a job for a long time. Then my mom got sick, and I suddenly needed money. Someone told me they were looking for a maitre d' at Hombre Lobo, someone who knew languages, so I went. For you, this is a game, but for me, it's life. I'm stuck in all of it. The squabbles, the intrigues, the gossip. Remember I mentioned the rumors about ghosts that look like wolves haunting Hombre Lobo? Someone from a rival restaurant started those rumors, and someone keeps scaring the staff and guests. Have you ever heard of the missing girls? One disappeared in 1995, the other in 1988. Both worked at Hombre Lobo.
Never!
That evening, Leticia finally picked up Vanished Without a Trace, hoping to distract herself from her thoughts of Pedro, and more Pedro. In the introduction, the author vividly and passionately painted a grim picture. In Mexico, disappearances had become a genuine social problem. This scourge knows no social, ethnic, or religious boundaries. In just one August of 2002, a 70-year-old homeless man, Jesus Limo, a 45-year-old spice vendor, Julia Olivares, and an 18-year-old daughter of wealthy parents, Veronica Margarita Cecilia Gonzalez y Sariñana, all vanished without a trace in the same city. Leticia stumbled over that sentence. She read it again and then again, until she realized 7 years. Ana Maria had disappeared exactly 7 years after Rosita Castro, and Veronica Margarita Cecilia had vanished 7 years after Ana Maria. The book didn't mention Veronica again. Leticia began searching online. There wasn't much. The girl had been on her way to visit her godmother and never arrived. No suspects, no ransom demands, no leads, no mentions of Hombre Lobo. But Veronica had a twin sister with a similarly complicated name, Fernanda Noelia Adoracion. Typing her name and surname into the search, Leticia found a Facebook profile for a Señora Fernanda Gonzalez y Sariñana Pizarro Ramirez. It seemed Veronica's sister had married and added her husband's name to her own, following the custom. Not expecting a response, Leticia messaged her. She introduced herself as a budding journalist, writing about missing girls, and asked if they could meet. Half an hour later, a reply arrived. "I'll be at the Ocean Spa from 12 to 2 on Friday. Ask at the reception desk. They'll direct you to me." Señora Fernanda turned out to be a tall, stylishly dressed, and impeccably groomed woman. There was something commanding about her demeanor, and she immediately took control of the conversation. "So, what do you want to know about Veronica?" "Just one thing. Did she have any connection to Hombre Lobo?" "It's strange you asked. We went there once with a group in the spring, 3 or 4 months before she disappeared. She liked a boy there, a waiter, and we all teased her about it. She even chatted with him a bit afterward, but the flirtation fizzled out. That's all." "Are you sure it fizzled out?" "Yes. We were very close. I knew everything about her. I even know she's been dead for a long time, and she died a horrible death. She came to me in a dream and told me so." A chill ran through Leticia, despite the warmth of the hotel lobby where they sat. What was his name? "It started with a P. Pablo Pedro." Leticia's heart began to race. She pulled out her smartphone, found the selfie she had taken with Pedro at the beach, and showed it to Señora Fernanda. "Is this him?" "Yes." "Do you know him?" "Yes. And he still works there. Did you tell the police about him?" "Of course. But he was cleared. On the day Veronica disappeared, he was in the hospital for surgery to repair an umbilical hernia. He was operated on." "That's a lie," Leticia muttered. "He doesn't have a scar on his stomach. But how old was he then?" 18, maybe 20. When was that photo taken? A couple of days ago? He hasn't changed a bit. Where can I read your article?" "In our university paper. In September." "All right. Send me the link on Facebook. Oh, my driver's already here. Yes, I'm coming. Goodbye, Leticia." "Goodbye." With a light step, Señora Fernanda left the hall while Leticia remained seated for a while, trying to process her thoughts and emotions. Then she grabbed her phone and typed "Missing Person August 2009" into the search engine. The fifth link led her to a website created by the relatives of missing people. Among the listed names was Concepcion Mana, who had left home on August 6, 2009, around 1 p.m., and hadn't been heard from since. Below the photo was a contact number for her family, but a mechanical voice informed Leticia that the number was no longer in service. But that no longer mattered. Leticia had no doubt that this girl had at least once visited Hombre Lobo and possibly knew Pedro. Pedro. He certainly didn't seem like a serial killer, But what did she know about serial killers anyway? She knew nothing about him, other than his first and last name. Well, that could easily be fixed. In less than a minute, she called her sister, but Luz was busy and wouldn't be free until 5 in the evening. Leticia begged Luz to find out everything she could about Pedro Valdez Navarro, and eventually she agreed. But don't expect anything before Monday or Tuesday. Thank you, Luz. You're the best sister in the world. Luz called back Monday evening. Pedro Gustavo Valdez Navarro, born January 8th, 1981, in our city. Graduated from university in 2002 with a degree in public relations. He's been working at Hombre Lobo since 2002. No criminal record, no arrests, no criminal activity. He's single and has never been married. No details about his personal life. His parents are deceased, and he's estranged from his older sister. That's it. Did any of this help you? Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Over the weekend, Pedro called her 3 times, saying sweet things and reminding her about the birthday on August 18th, the one that was actually in January. Why was that date so important to him? What had he planned? Looking for answers, Leticia scoured the internet but found only that in 2016, the night of August 18th would be a full moon. On a whim, she entered the date of Ana Maria's disappearance into the same astronomy site. Odd. That had also been a full moon. What about Veronica, full moon? Rosita, full moon. Conception, full moon. All the girls had disappeared on the eve of the August full moon. There was a clear, though still inexplicable, connection between the dates. The question was whether Pedro was solely responsible, or if someone else was involved. There were no doubts about Veronica. It was highly likely that Pedro had a hand in Concepcion's disappearance too. In 1995, he would have been 14, but theoretically, he could have played a role, maybe luring the victim. But in 1988, he had been only 7. That meant someone else was responsible for Rosita's disappearance. Someone else from Hombre Lobo. The Nunez gang had nothing to do with this. The threads of all 4 disappearances led back to the same place, the cave bar. But what was it? A lair of serial killers passing the torch to one another. And why wait 7 years between killings? Why commit the crime on the night of the full moon? And wasn't it time to go to the police, considering the next August full moon was tomorrow? The thought of going to the police had crossed her mind many times over the past few days, and each time she had dismissed it. What could she say? All she had were suspicions and eerie coincidences, and Pedro's lie. But lying wasn't a crime in this case, and who besides her had heard his words? He'd already been suspected in Veronica's disappearance and cleared. Inviting her to an August birthday that was actually in January? That wasn't proof. Besides, she couldn't shake the feeling that Pedro was just part of something much bigger, something called Hombre Lobo. Hombre Lobo, with only glowing reviews on TripAdvisor. A bar in a cave, a restaurant in a cave, an interesting place worth visiting. She had already been on the official website before. Nothing there except beautiful photos, reviews, and business hours. No scandals, no interviews. She hadn't even been able to find out how long Hombre Lobo had been in business or who owned it. The internet knew very little about the place. All right, Luz could help her figure out who the owner was. In the meantime, Leticia decided to investigate when the bar might have opened. It seemed unlikely the bar would have been opened before the beach itself, as that would have been ridiculous. Opening a bar in an empty, deserted area. She turned her search to the beach. With the beach, the search went more smoothly. Fairly quickly, she found out that the beach had opened in the late 1960s. For some reason, its opening was presented as a major achievement. She clicked through link after link until she stumbled upon an old, forgotten page run by a beach enthusiast. In the history section, he had posted a scan of an ancient interview. The interviewee was Señor Humberto Fuentes, the CEO of the construction corporation that had built the beach. In the interview, he said, "It's also a wonderful example of how the advancement of science and technology helps overcome centuries of backwardness. People used to fear coming to this coastline because of the Howling Cave, but now students and tourists happily play beach volleyball, and there hasn't been a single accident in 5 years. May the Holy Virgin of Guadalupe protect us." There were no other caves near the beach. That much Leticia knew for sure. So that's what Hombre Lobo had been called in its maiden days, the Howling Cave. The founder of the restaurant had been an eccentric person, and he had done a lot for the venue's image. There was no information about the Howling Cave. Maybe the legend still circulated among the local population. But regular folk didn't go to Hombre Lobo and didn't spend time on the internet. It wasn't until 3 in the morning that Leticia finally got lucky. In a collection of academic articles, she found a mention of the Howling Cave. An example of the unethical use of folklore material can be seen in Carl Scherer's description of the Howling Cave rituals, later exposed as fiction. In parentheses, there was a reference to a book titled Secret Cults of Mesoamerica, published in Vienna in 1932, in German. According to his biography, Scherer had been an interesting character. An Austrian by birth, he was born in Vienna in 1890 to a bureaucrat's family. After finishing high school, he entered the law faculty at the University of Vienna, nearly completed his degree, but then attended an exhibition on Aztec culture and became fascinated with Mesoamerica. He dropped out of law school, learned Spanish, and in 1912 moved to Mexico. There, he collected folklore and studied local traditions and customs. After World War I, his articles were regularly published in German and Austrian academic journals, and in 1932 his book came out, sparking mixed reviews. In 1939, after the Anschluss, Scherer returned to Vienna, then moved to Berlin, and in 1942 set off on an expedition to Tibet. In the Himalayas, he was detained by the British and taken to London. Odd considering the war. In London, he supposedly lived freely, not imprisoned, but in July 1944, for some reason, he jumped out of a 6th-floor window and died. Modern science takes a skeptical view of Scherer's legacy. His correspondence with Mircea Eliade from 1929-30 is considered his most valuable contribution. However, there are those who believe Scherer has been underestimated and that his work deserves further study. The owner of the website where Leticia had found this biography seemed to belong to the latter group. In the library section, he had posted Secret Cults of Mesoamerica, but in German. Translating such a large book using an auto-translator was beyond Leticia's patience, so she wrote to the site owner, asking if he could point her to the section where Scherer had written about the Howling Cave. Having accomplished this, Leticia collapsed into bed. It was already light outside, and slept until noon. When she woke up, the first thing she did was check her email. No response yet. On her phone, there were 3 missed calls from Pedro. She didn't feel like answering or talking at all. Isabel called, inviting her shopping, and Leticia agreed, just to distract herself. After the shopping trip, Isabel came over and stayed until 9. During that time, Pedro bombarded her with calls and texts, and her inbox remained empty. Finally, Isabel left, and almost immediately, the long-awaited reply arrived. "Sorry for the German, but I hope you can translate with an auto-translator." She could. It wasn't difficult at all. In 1677, the High Inquisitor of Mexico began an investigation into the worship of primal demons, also known as coyote-like lords, in the Howling Cave. 18 people were burned in connection with this case, and the details were deemed so disturbing that the Inquisitor chose not to make them public. It was widely believed that the Inquisitors were dealing with the continuation of Aztec pagan cults. Similar to the Mayas' Xibalba, the local tribes believed in the existence of a cave that served as a portal to the world of primal demons, which took on coyote-like forms. Unlike the spirits of Xibalba, the cave demons were considered real. They could both harm and help. Many of the references to these creatures can be classified as lycanthropy. Based on existing records, these primal demons can also be related to mythical creatures known as Dogman. The primary way to maintain good relations with these entities was through regular sacrificial rituals. Despite the Inquisition's efforts, the ritual survived in its original form and continued to be practiced until relatively recently. My informant Jorge described the ceremony to me in detail. Every 7 years, during the August full moon, the priests prepare what's called the Red Dinner for the coyote-like lords. The demons leave their underground lairs and come to the cave, where a feast of blood and flesh is prepared for them. The victim is always a young, beautiful girl who is stripped, tied to the altar, and her flesh is slowly cut away piece by piece so that she stays alive as long as possible. The pieces of her flesh are served as the meal for the primal lords. The heart is the last to be cut out. The ceremony is accompanied by the consumption of a ritual drink made from cactus juice, which likely causes the priests to see the demons. According to the informant, performing the ceremony is crucial for the prosperity of the entire region. A few paragraphs suddenly changed the world around her. The walls and objects remained the same, but the world itself was different. The almost full moon, peeking through the window from the sky, turned into the round, watching eye of a madman. If only she had known that the fragments of the mosaic she had been piecing together over the past few weeks would form such a horrifying picture. But they fit so perfectly that there was no doubt. The ritual was still being carried out every 7 years, organized by the people working at Hombre Lobo. The mysticism could be discarded. Scherer had written that under the influence of drugs, one could see anything. 2 things were important. First, this group of maniacs definitely had protection. Pedro couldn't have cleaned up the information space so thoroughly by himself. And second, tonight was the 18th. The full moon would rise in 2 hours, and this time, the role of the victim was reserved for her. But what were they planning? She would never go back to Hombre Lobo. Were they going to storm her apartment? Unlikely. They were too afraid of publicity. Actually, that gave her an idea. She could write a letter, clearly laying out everything she knew, and threaten that if she disappeared, it would be sent to every newspaper, TV station, the police, the prosecutor's office, and so on. Setting up such an automatic email was a piece of cake. Feeling emboldened, Leticia started on the letter. Writing the text calmed her, making her feel strong. After an hour of carefully crafting the words, the letter was ready. Short, but very convincing. Leticia hit save one last time and opened her email. Suddenly, the laptop screen flickered and went black. No matter how hard Leticia tried to figure out what had happened, her nearly new laptop had suddenly died. It could have been a coincidence. Or maybe not. The apartment had become eerily quiet. Leticia noticed the silence for the first time, and she didn't like it. Quiet. Like a cave, damn it. The TV in the old neighbor's apartment wasn't murmuring. The neighbor upstairs wasn't stomping. And the wall clock had stopped. The laptop had gone silent, too. It felt as though she was the only person left in the entire apartment building. Wanting to dispel this feeling, Leticia opened the window and looked outside. The windows on both sides were dark. Her neighbors were either asleep or out, despite the late hour. The windows above were also dark, and the apartment below hers was vacant, with no tenants for the time being. And there was not a soul to be seen in the courtyard. Only the moon in the sky, deathly pale, waiting for something. But it would wait in vain. She would call Luz, her sister wasn't asleep, at 11:30, and ask her and her husband to come pick her up. But then her smartphone suddenly prompted her to enter a password, even though Leticia had never set one. She spent the next 10 minutes trying in vain to unlock it, but whoever had hacked into it and set the password knew what they were doing. The landline was her last option. She picked up the receiver and heard, "This number has been disconnected at the request of the owner." So she was left without any means of communication. And what now? They wouldn't really try to abduct her from her own apartment, would they? There was a concierge downstairs. They were just trying to scare her, to make her do something foolish, like leave in the middle of the night to go to Luz's place. But instead of doing something foolish, she would go down to the concierge and call from his cell phone. Leticia stood in the hallway and stared at the heavy door. The door was steel, the lock secure. As long as it was locked, no one could get in. Her apartment was on the 11th floor of a 16-story building. They wouldn't come in through the window. So, should she go to the concierge? Or wait out the night without any communication, but safe? Quietly, on tiptoes, Leticia approached the door and looked through the peephole. 3 dark figures stood in the hallway, listening, it seemed, just as she was. What were they planning to do? Pick the lock? But she would make noise. Then again, no one would hear it. There was no one to hear. She recoiled. Her heart was pounding wildly, and sweat beaded on her forehead. For the first time, she felt genuine fear, and it took an immense effort not to let it overwhelm her. If she gave in to panic, she would die. Turn on the water in the kitchen and block the drain. The water would flood the apartments below, and people would come running. But that would take 25 minutes, and they would open the door before then. Fight? She had no weapons except for kitchen knives. There were faint sounds outside the door. They were about to start. Dear God, guide me. There must be a way out. Leticia's eyes landed on the smoke detector, and she had a sudden idea. She dashed to the kitchen, where Isabel had left a lighter on the table. Leticia grabbed it, ran to the curtain, and lit the edge. The curtain caught fire immediately. Then she set fire to a stack of glossy magazines, which began to release thick, black smoke. To help the flames along, Leticia opened the window. In just 3 minutes, thick smoke was pouring out of the kitchen window. Leticia locked herself in her bedroom and opened the window. Now, she just had to hope the firefighters would get to her first. As it sometimes happens not only in the movies, but also in real life, the firefighters arrived just in time. The laptop and smartphone were destroyed in the fire. What had happened to them, how they had been hacked, and from which IP address Leticia never found out. since the repairs to the rented apartment cost Luz a fortune. She refused to rent a new place for her sister, and Leticia moved in with her, which she was very happy about. The sisters never spoke about Hombre Lobo again, except for when Leticia asked Luz to find out if any girls had gone missing in their city on August 18th. But no, this time no girls had disappeared, not in the city, nor in the entire province. Several years later, when her husband suggested they attend his boss's anniversary party, Leticia happily agreed. After being cooped up at home with her twin daughters, she was eager for some fun and celebration. The party was a grand affair, with around 200 guests. During a break, the host was showing off his garden to the guests. By the pond with the goldfish, a man in a white suit, slightly styled after the 1940s or 50s, approached Leticia. She felt a jolt of recognition. It was the manager from Hombre Lobo. "Good evening, Senora Leticia. It's been 5 years. You got married? Congratulations. I knew a beauty like you wouldn't stay single for long. And are you still working at the same place? Then send my regards to Pedro." "Alas, Pedro left us. He disappeared shortly after you quit without leaving an address. Such a pity. He was so quick, so clever. Only one woman was quicker than him." The manager's lips curled into a thin, predatory smile. The smile of a lizard. "He didn't happen to leave on August 18th, did he?" Leticia asked, the words slipping out on their own. The manager winked at her, leaned in, and whispered conspiratorially. "You guessed it. There's no ritual that can't be changed, Senora Leticia."
Story 2.
We had been advancing along the creek's bank, carefully examining the ground for any traces or items that could shed light on Ethan's disappearance. For a whole week now, we had been searching for my friend and colleague, a national park ranger who vanished during his daily patrol and failed to make contact. As we initiated the search operation, we soon realized the vastness of our park and the daunting task of thoroughly searching it. Other rescue services, as well as friends, relatives, and volunteers, joined us, but so far, it hadn't yielded any results. A sudden rustle in the trees made me instantly raise my head. I recognized it as an eagle struggling to ascend into the air, its wings beating powerfully and causing the branches to sway under its weight. Continuing on, I kept my gaze fixed on the sky until I stumbled, barely maintaining my balance from an imminent fall. Regaining my footing, my eyes suddenly caught something glimmering in the water under the sunlight. Crouching by the bank and rolling up my sleeve, I retrieved a metal badge from the cool stream. With anticipation gripping my heart, I examined it. It was Ethan's badge. This find became a long-awaited breakthrough in our search. Excitedly, I called out to Sarah, who was nearby, and showed her my discovery. Her face lit up with excitement. Finally, after 2 weeks of relentless searching, we found a lead. Immediately contacting our colleagues, I informed them of our location and discovery. Then, together with Sarah, we continued to follow along the creek, winding up the slope. Reasoning that the current might have carried the badge from higher points, we carefully scanned every nook along its banks, hoping to uncover more. Our path soon led us to dense undergrowth, and entering it, we continued along the rushing water. The tree canopies intertwined tightly above us, casting a dim light in which cool silence prevailed, occasionally interrupted by the rustle of leaves. Venturing deeper into the forest, we unexpectedly stumbled upon an ancient Native American burial ground, hidden from the world by dense vegetation. The place seemed frozen in time, with graves engulfed by earth and tree roots. We cautiously made our way among the stone mounds, treading carefully on forgotten paths. when suddenly an astonishing sight greeted our eyes. In the center of the burial ground, in a small clearing, stood an ancient altar. Carved from stone, it was covered in moss and lichen, bearing witness to its unimaginable age. Inscribed symbols and pictograms adorned the altar, their meanings lost to time, but undoubtedly indicating its sacred purpose. Approaching closer, we felt a strange, almost electric tension in the air, as if the place still teemed with ancient energy. I glanced around for clues and noticed something protruding from under the grass. Drawing closer, I realized it was a torn piece of a shirt, identical in color to mine. This discovery alarmed me. I beckoned Sarah, and we decided to continue our search in that direction. As we walked along the trail, we carefully examined every bush, and soon we found a strange track. It resembled a wolf track in some ways, but was sized more like a bear's, although the paw shape was entirely different. What could it be? This find put us on edge, and we began to thoroughly search the surroundings. Here, we found items that apparently belonged to Ethan. However, they were torn to shreds, with traces of blood nearby. We continued our search in hopes of finding at least a body, but found nothing. It was strange. It seemed Ethan was attacked by some animal, but whether he escaped was unclear. We contacted the base and called in specialists. While we awaited their arrival, fog enveloped the area. It was highly unexpected, as specific conditions such as low temperature and evaporation are required for fog formation. It seemed as if someone had activated a smoke machine, and the fog began spreading through the forest. I looked at Sarah. Alarm was evident in her eyes, and I felt out of place myself. Suddenly, we heard some noise among the trees. Due to the fog, visibility was poor, but I distinctly noticed some creature darting past us. I drew my pistol, and Sarah did the same. We stood back to back, trying to understand what surrounded us. Then came clicking sounds, as if a skeleton was clacking its jaws. After that, red lights appeared around us, emerging in pairs. I realized they were glowing eyes. Damn, what's happening? I thought. In all my ranger career, I had never encountered anything like this. The sounds and glowing eyes drew closer, the circle tightening, but suddenly we heard voices to our left. It was the backup we had called for. The lights abruptly dimmed, and the fog began to dissipate. We understood that our colleagues had thwarted the attack. Soon, a man in police uniform approached us, whom I recognized immediately. It was Detective Harris, who worked in our small town. Overall, he was good at his job. Seeing our alarmed faces, he immediately asked, "Hey guys, what's going on? What scared you like this?" We shared the story with him, and he listened attentively, though he couldn't hide his skepticism, noting how hard it was to believe. We didn't try to convince him. The forensic experts began examining the crime scene, cordoning it off with yellow tape. After a couple of hours, they reached a preliminary conclusion. There had been an attack by an unknown animal, but it remained unclear whether the person had survived. We surveyed the area, but no further traces were found. With time still left until evening, we expanded the search radius, but unfortunately, it was fruitless. In the evening, we returned to base, after which I got into my pickup and headed into town. In my pocket lay Ethan's badge. The journey took about half an hour. Exiting the highway, I turned onto a small street lined with neat houses. Pulling up opposite one of them, I got out of the car and climbed the porch. Knocking, I waited. Soon, a young woman emerged with a child in her arms. Her face bore the signs of difficult times. Dark circles under her eyes and a tear-stained face. She was Ethan's wife. When she saw me, hope flickered in her eyes, but upon seeing my somber expression, she bit her lip with pain. "Hey, Jess, how are you? Did you find anything?" She interrupted me without answering. I nodded, pulling the badge from my pocket, and recounted what we had discovered today, expressing the possibility that Ethan might be dead. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she wiped them away with her hand and said, "I don't believe he's dead. I feel he's alive. So don't tell me that again." I apologized to her and said that we would continue the search. After that, I bid her farewell. It was already dark when I decided I needed to clear my head. I headed to the local bar, parked my pickup, and looked around. People were casually discussing their everyday problems. At that moment, I found it hard to relate to them. In the bar, I ordered myself a couple of beers and sat contemplating the day's events. Suddenly, someone sat down next to me. Turning around, I recognized David Harris, the detective I had met earlier. He also ordered a beer. We sat in silence for a couple of minutes, after which David asked, "Listen, about the stuff you told today. Did it really happen, or could it have been a hallucination?" I nodded. "Yeah, it was real unexplainable madness. For the first time in my life, I encountered something like that. Plus, Ethan's mysterious disappearance and the remnants of his clothes. You know, I never really believed in the supernatural, but this time, I even felt like going to church and praying. Understand? When faced with something inexplicable, you start looking for some grain of rationality, but," David continued, "I believe there's an explanation for everything. You just have to search. I'm sorry about your friend, but someday we'll unravel this mystery." We continued drinking until late at night, immersed in thoughts and discussions about a world that turned out to be much more mysterious and ambiguous than we could have imagined. A phone call woke me up early in the morning. Answering the phone, I heard David's familiar voice. "Good morning, Mike. We've got trouble. Could you come and help?" he asked. I agreed, quickly got dressed, washed up, and without wasting time on breakfast, called a taxi. 20 minutes later, I arrived at the specified address. It was a farm with several police cars already parked outside. Entering, I noticed David and his colleagues talking to, presumably, the farm owner. Spotting me, David motioned for me to join him. "Something similar to yesterday's happened here. I'd like you to assess the tracks and listen to the witness, comparing it to what happened yesterday," he said. I nodded in agreement, and we approached the farmer. He was a man in his 40s with a thick beard, dressed in coveralls. Genuine fear was evident in his eyes. That alone made me worry. The man named Bill began to recount. I woke up to the sound of the dogs barking. Usually they don't just bark for no reason, and when they encounter something unfamiliar, the barking becomes more intense. This time it seemed like they were in a fight. I felt fear, thinking that some animal or stranger might have gotten onto the property. Grabbing my gun, I headed to the yard, which was shrouded in fog. With a flashlight in hand, I tried to light the way, but could see only a few feet ahead. Instinctively, I headed towards the barn, where the dog barking was coming from. As I approached, I heard a plaintive whimper, and then everything went silent. Continuing forward, I looked around for danger when suddenly a pair of eyes lit up to my left, and then another to my right. One by one, multiple glowing eyes appeared around me. After that, I heard clicking sounds. It really scared me. I started backing away, but the circle was closing in. You understand, I was terrified. I fired my gun in all directions, but the eyes started disappearing one by one. After a series of shots, I dropped the gun and ran to the house, managing to close the door behind me. Then something hit it, but I didn't hear any more sounds. Only those same clicking sounds. After that, I called the police, but by the time you arrived, the fog had cleared and I didn't dare go out to check. After hearing Bill's story, it was clear that it perfectly matched mine. Meeting David's gaze, we shared a silent understanding. Then he led me to the scene, prefacing, "When we arrived here and saw what had happened, damn, it really shocked us, and now you'll see it all yourself and understand." Approaching the barn, I discovered a sight that shocked me. Gnawed dog bodies, leaving only bones shining in the sun. But these weren't ancient remains. They were fresh, sun-glinting bones, seemingly meticulously cleaned of skin and flesh. But the scariest part was that they left complete intact skeletons. It seemed as though someone had simply sucked out all the flesh. Around lay the remains of 3 dogs. Nearby, someone exclaimed, "Oh my God, my dogs! What happened to them?" It was Bill. David admitted that he hadn't dared to show the farm owner what had happened earlier. We continued our journey and soon reached the cattle pen, fenced off with wooden beams. Before we entered, David pointed out the tracks, the same huge ones we had found in the park, resembling wolf tracks but much larger, alongside which were numerous small, thin tracks resembling those of birds. After examining them, we entered the pen, where a horrifying sight awaited us. Evidently, there used to be a herd of cows here. I counted about 25, but all that remained of them were skeletons, akin to the fate of the dogs. I glanced at the farm owner, whose face turned completely pale with shock. David approached me and asked, "Do you think it could have been aliens?" Unable to muster the strength to deny it, I replied, "Damn, after seeing everything, you can believe anything." The dog and cow skeletons left without flesh and hides created a scene that led to the most incredible hypotheses. "I've already called in specialists," David informed me, surveying the scene. "They should arrive soon. The problem is that such an attack could also happen to humans. We need to take some measures." We both stood there, shocked by what we had seen, when a team of forensic experts arrived and began collecting samples. "Listen, buddy," David turned to me. "This is some serious stuff, and it would be great if you could help me with this." "Of course, no problem," I replied. "I'll start my investigation. If similar incidents occur, keep me informed." With that, our conversation ended, and I returned home, then headed to work. There I met Sarah and told her about what had happened. This story truly frightened her. We sat, trying to figure out what it could be, but nothing sensible came to mind. Suddenly, Sarah looked up and said, "I remembered something. We passed by an Indian cemetery at the beginning. Maybe it's somehow connected?" I also recalled it. Indeed, if this is related to something supernatural, this place could play a role, I said. "Perhaps you're right. This week I'll visit my acquaintance in the reservation nearby and ask him more about it." A couple of days passed, during which we tried to find traces of Ethan, but to no avail. The next day I had a planned visit to the reservation, but my plans were disrupted by another call from David. "Hello, hey Mike. You need to come urgently. Something terrible has happened here. It's really a horrific sight. Come to the Green Street area, where concerts and festivals usually take place. It's urgent, Mike. Waiting for you," David said over the phone. I promised to come soon and hung up. Then I noticed that the office was buzzing. Such commotion usually only happened during major incidents. I asked a colleague what had happened, and he informed me about a massive attack at a music festival. Realizing that it was serious, I hurried to the scene. On the way, it was evident that an emergency situation had occurred in the city. Fire trucks and ambulances were rushing in one direction. Upon arriving, I saw a large gathering of service vehicles and many concerned people. Medical personnel were assisting young people who seemed utterly shaken. Passing through the cordon and informing them that I had been summoned by Detective David, I was allowed into the crime scene. The concert venue was cordoned off. Many police officers, forensic experts in protective suits, and other specialists were surveying the area. Approaching, I found David, who was in conversation at that moment. When he saw me, he motioned for me to join him and said, "Damn, this time it's serious. You need to see this." Leading me to the scene of the tragedy, I encountered a horrific sight. Numerous human skeletons lay on the ground without flesh, creating a grim and terrifying atmosphere. David explained to me that a concert had taken place here, gathering many young people. Everyone was having fun, unaware of the looming threat. Suddenly, the venue was engulfed in fog, which initially didn't cause concern. However, soon screams of horror and pain rang out, and panic ensued. Something unknown hiding in the fog began killing people. As he continued to explain the situation, he led me to a group of people sitting, covered in blankets and trembling with fear. The suffocating terror was evident in their eyes. "These are the survivors. We managed to barely get their testimonies," David concluded. Surveying the young people who had survived their worst nightmare, I wondered if they would ever recover from the horror they had experienced. David approached me again and informed me that 25 people had died, and this time, the investigation would involve the Federal Service. The dispatch of a significant number of personnel was expected, as well as the deployment of special forces, and even the possibility of mobilizing the National Guard for searches over an extensive area. "Do you have any theories about what this could be?" he asked me. I shared my thoughts with David about the cemetery and my plan to visit the reservation. "That's a great idea," David agreed. "I'll go with you. Wait for me here for about 20 minutes. I'll finish up with things, and then we'll go together." After some time standing by my pickup, I saw David heading towards me. We got into the car and headed west from the city, where the Indian reservation was located a few miles away. There lived my acquaintance Jack, who held the position of head of the local community. As we approached the reservation, we were greeted by vast untouched lands shrouded in tranquility and silence, against the backdrop of which modern elements sharply contrasted. Signs, small road signs, and modest informational signs telling about the history and culture of the local residents. The landscapes of the reservation were diverse, from lush forests to open spaces with low vegetation, creating a sense of harmony with nature. Driving onto the reservation, we noticed several scattered dwellings throughout its area. These were modest houses, combining both traditional and modern construction techniques. Despite their simplicity, the houses seemed cozy and welcoming. Around the houses, various utility buildings could be seen, as well as small gardens where vegetables and herbs were grown. As we moved through the reservation, we began to notice people going about their daily activities. Some of them stopped to wave at us in a friendly manner. Pulling up to one of the houses located in the heart of the reservation, we parked the car. The house in front of which we parked stood out among the others for its neatness and well-kept appearance. Surrounded by a low fence, it was built of wood, which gave it a warm feel. Around the house, various flowers were blooming, and there were 2 chairs and a small table at the entrance, creating a cozy atmosphere for evening gatherings outdoors. We approached the door and knocked. After a moment, Jack came out to us. He was of average height with a strong and sturdy build, indicating a person accustomed to physical labor. Jack's eyes were dark and penetrating, studying us with curiosity and friendliness. Jack was dressed in the traditional clothing of his people, which included a brightly embroidered shirt and wide trousers adorned with patterns. A band adorned his head, symbolizing his status in the community. Jack invited us inside and led us into the living room where we comfortably settled on the couch. Within moments, he returned with a tray on which cups of fragrant tea were placed. "It's been a while since we've seen each other, Mike. Tell me, what brings you to my neck of the woods?" he calmly asked, pouring the tea. We shared with him the story of the incidents in the city and mentioned the Indian cemetery. Jack listened attentively and, with a sigh of surprise, remarked, "It really sounds like something supernatural." Then he pondered something. "Tell me, what do you think? Could this be connected to the cemetery? Or perhaps you know some myths on this topic?" I asked him. He paused for a moment, scratching his chin, and replied, "There is one legend that could explain what's happening, although I'm not sure if it's directly related to the cemetery. Just listen." And then he began to tell his story. In ancient times, when the lands were young and the forests were dense among the Indian people, there was a legend of the great wolf spirit, known as Manitou Wanderer. It was said that he roamed the world between the living and the dead, governing the souls of those who had already departed earthly paths. Manitou Wanderer was the guardian of order between the worlds, but his power was dual, just like himself. Once, the world of the living and the world of spirits collided due to a rupture created by human greed and disrespect for nature. This rupture allowed the souls of the dead to return to the world of the living not for reunion, but for vengeance and chaos. Seeing the destruction caused by this imbalance, Manitou Wanderer decided to intervene to restore order. According to legend, the wolf spirit possessed a powerful amulet made of moonstone and wolf fang. This amulet gave him the power to control the souls of the dead, summoning them and sending them back to the realm of shadows. But Manitou Wanderer knew that direct intervention would alter the natural course of things. So he chose another path. He appealed to the elders of the tribe to gather warriors and shamans to perform a ritual that would restore harmony between the worlds. For 3 days and 3 nights, the tribe gathered around the sacred fire, praying and offering sacrifices to Manitou Wanderer to appease him and restore balance. At the culmination of the ritual, when the moon reached its fullness, Manitou Wanderer appeared before the tribe accompanied by a pack of wolf spirits. The great wolf spirit raised the amulet to the heavens, and its light filled the rift between the worlds, sealing it and sending the souls of the dead back to the realm of shadows, restoring peace and order. Since then, Manitou Wanderer has become a symbol of protection and balance restoration. The legend says that every time harmony between the worlds is disturbed, one should look at the moon, and the glow of the amulet of the great wolf spirit can be seen, reminding of the need for respect for nature and the world of spirits. We absorbed every word of this amazing story attentively. Reflecting on the tale, I couldn't help but think that in many ways, this legend echoes in our events. Perhaps these huge tracks belong to a giant wolf. But then, who left those small prints? I pondered aloud. Turning to Jack, I asked, "What do you think? How can we defeat this creature?" After a moment of thought, he replied, "If this is indeed Manitou, then perhaps the key is the amulet he always carries with him, which emits his power." We immersed ourselves for a moment in reflections on what this amulet could be. But soon realization dawned on me. Here we were in the middle of the day, discussing matters pertaining to the supernatural, and suddenly the atmosphere around us seemed to be filled with a certain mystique, lending everything that was happening a surreal tint. It was truly a strange and unusual feeling. After finishing the tea, we thanked Jack for his hospitality and wisdom, and then headed back to the city. Upon arriving, we found that armed squads had begun to arrive in the city. It was a special forces unit, although it was difficult to say exactly which service it belonged to. David made a call to someone and then asked me to go to the outskirts of the city, where a military camp had already been set up. Surveying the scene spread out before us, I realized that the situation had taken a very serious turn, as significant forces were now involved in resolving the problem. Arriving at the camp, we were directed to the Chief of Staff. He was a typical military man in camouflage uniform with imposing mustaches. He greeted us warmly and asked us to explain all the details of our story. Listening to us, he seemed to hesitate for a moment, and from his facial expression, I understood that he was wavering whether to believe us or not, as our story indeed seemed incredible. Upon completion, he said, "I have taken note of your story, but we will act by the book. We will divide our forces and conduct searches of the forest by sectors." We asked for permission to join one of the groups, and to our surprise, he agreed, considering our affiliation with law enforcement. Summoning one of the commanders, a lieutenant named Smith, he assigned us to his command. The lieutenant nodded in agreement and led us to his men, where we were introduced to the soldiers and provided with the necessary equipment. Soon, the order to move out was given, and we, getting into jeeps, set out on our way. 20 minutes into the journey, we found ourselves at the edge of the forest, where Lieutenant Smith announced that we were to inspect a specific area of the territory. Together with the squad, we entered the dense thickets of the forest, where every step concealed uncertainty. The forest enveloped us in its silence, broken only by the rustle of our footsteps on the fallen leaves and the distant sounds of forest life. The soldiers moved confidently, but there was tension in their movements, as if they expected something unexpected to happen at any moment. Lieutenant Smith occasionally gave commands, regulating the course of the search operations while we tried not to lag behind, looking around. Our path was illuminated only by the rays of the sun, piercing through the dense foliage, creating patches of light and shadow on the ground, which added even more mystique to the surrounding landscape. Exploring every clearing, every overgrown corner, we hoped to find some clue or hint. From time to time, the forest would throw false clues at us. Sounds that seemed like footsteps or the rustling of something big made us freeze and strain our hearing. But each time it turned out to be just a figment of our imagination, fueled by our fears. Nevertheless, the further we progressed, the more intrusive became the feeling of an invisible presence, as if the forest were watching us, assessing our actions. But apart from this oppressive feeling, we found no concrete evidence of our purpose. As the sun began to set, it became clear that our searches had not been successful. We had explored the designated square inside and out, but had not found the slightest trace or confirmation of our fears. Considering that we had little time left, I suggested making a short detour and checking out the Indian cemetery. This area was familiar to me, so I confidently pointed in the direction, assuring that we could reach it in just half an hour. After a short deliberation, Lieutenant Smith agreed, and we immediately set off. The hike to the cemetery was quiet, only occasionally interrupted by the rustle of leaves under our feet and the distant sounds of forest life. The surrounding nature seemed to freeze in anticipation, realizing our goal. The landscape gradually changed as we approached the cemetery, becoming more severe and impressive. The trees seemed older, and the air was saturated with the scent of the past and secrets. When we reached the designated spot, The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft sunset hues. Approaching one of the monuments, I noticed on it a worn-out sign in the shape of a crescent, which undoubtedly resembled a wolf's fang. This discovery made me freeze in the realization that this place indeed had a direct connection to the legend of Manitou. I turned to share my discovery with David, but the words froze on my lips when I saw the expressions on the faces of my companions. Everyone around started exchanging frightened glances, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The reason was the slowly spreading fog around us, which seemed to emerge out of nowhere and began to envelop the cemetery, making the surrounding atmosphere even more mystical and ominous. The silence around became almost palpable, interrupted only by our heavy breathing and the beating of our own hearts. Then, in this all-encompassing silence, crackling sounds rang out, causing us to tense even more. At first, they seemed distant and barely perceptible, but with each passing minute they grew louder and clearer, as if the source of the sound was approaching us through the fog. And then, in that flickering darkness, red eyes began to appear. At first one pair, then another, and soon around us through the mist a multitude of red dots menacingly twinkled. They seemed to peer into us, assessing, scrutinizing, causing every cell in our bodies to fill with chilling fear. We stood, petrified with horror, realizing that our encounter with the legend might have been all too real. For a moment, it seemed that time stood still, and the whole world narrowed down to this moment of confrontation with the unknown. In an instant, Lieutenant Smith urgently called for backup over the radio, his voice sounding urgent and alarmed. But before reinforcements could arrive, horrifying silhouettes began to manifest from the dense fog. First came a gigantic humanoid wolf whose imposing figure towered over us. Its fur was as dark as night, eyes glowing with red fire, full of bloodlust and anger. The wolf's powerful paws seemed crafted for destruction, and its razor-sharp fangs looked menacing enough to make the blood run cold in our veins. Following it, skeletal wolves began to materialize from the mist. Their eye sockets glowed with the same red light, and some of them had traces of flesh emerging on their bones, creating a grotesque contrast between the living and the dead. They turned their empty gazes towards us, beginning to growl menacingly. The atmosphere of tension reached its peak when one of the soldiers, unable to withstand the pressure, fired a shot. This shot served as a signal to the start of the skirmish. Wolves, animated by some ancient evil, attacked with unprecedented ferocity. They lunged at the soldiers, their fangs effortlessly piercing through protective gear, sucking the life out of their victims. Cries and moans filled the air, creating a hellish scene on Earth. I fought back, trying to protect myself and my comrades. But the enemy's strength was overwhelming. In that moment of desperate despair, David grabbed me and dragged me down the stream, trying to get us out of harm's way. We ran over slippery rocks, wading through the cold water that lashed at our feet. The sounds of the skirmish gradually faded behind us, but fear continued to drive us forward. We ran, straining every muscle, every nerve, trying to get as far away as possible from the scene of the nightmare unfolding behind us. The forest under our feet quickly gave way to the stream, whose cold waters enveloped our boots, making each step heavier than the last. The air around us was filled with the scent of moisture and earth, which suddenly began to mix with something cold and damp, foreshadowing the approach of the fog. And then we felt the fog thickening behind us like a living creature, eager to engulf us in its embrace. Looking back, we saw dense streams of fog slowly but steadily catching up to us, spreading across the ground like a blanket. concealing the unknown beneath it. The sounds of clicks and rustles grew closer and clearer, filling the air with a sense of imminent danger. These sounds emanating from the fog made our hearts beat even faster, and thoughts of being pursued by something indescribable spurred our steps. We ran with all our might. Each time it seemed that the fog was catching up to us, forcing us to give it our all, discarding all fatigue and fear. Breathing became increasingly difficult. Panic hung in the air, but we continued to move forward, hoping to find shelter, or at least temporary salvation from our invisible pursuers. Continuing our desperate run through the fog-shrouded forest, we suddenly noticed assistance. A group of armed soldiers in full gear swiftly arrived at the scene of the skirmish, quickly and efficiently beginning to surround the area. Their numbers were impressive, and they immediately engaged in combat, creating a new front of resistance before our eyes. In the midst of the new battle, my attention was drawn to a massive wolf, standing out with its power and ferocity. Around its neck hung an amulet, catching my eye with its shimmer even through the veil of mist. Realizing the key role of this amulet, I shouted to the soldiers to focus fire on the wolf and try to sever the amulet. My words found resonance among the commanders, and one of them immediately gave the order. In the next moment, hundreds of bullets flew towards the wolf, but they only glanced off its dark fur, causing no significant harm. The creature seemed invulnerable, indestructible. And then I noticed David seizing the moment, taking aim and waiting for the optimal time to shoot. When David fired, a sharp, piercing click rang out. The amulet around the wolf's neck, as if sensing the impending threat, briefly flashed brighter before shattering into two pieces. When the amulet was shattered, the enormous wolf let out a long, agonizing howl that reverberated throughout the surroundings, sending shivers down even the bravest soldiers' spines. Something incredible began to happen around it. The fog started to dissipate, and the wolf's skeletons, which just moments ago were full of aggression and strength, began to crumble into dust as if their connection to this world had been severed forever. What happened next resembled a slow awakening from a nightmare. Silence descended, only occasionally interrupted by the quiet sounds of the forest returning to its usual life. The soldiers, stunned by what had occurred, gradually lowered the tension until they ceased fire, realizing that the threat had been eliminated. As the smoke of battle cleared and the world around began to regain its familiar outlines, I saw in the place of the massive wolf my friend Ethan, lying unconscious. The shock of seeing my old friend before me was so great that it momentarily paralyzed me. My legs carried me to him, while my heart pounded with both horror and hope. The fear of losing a friend mixed with relief when I finally heard his breathing, weak but steady. Medics, quickly arriving on the scene, took Ethan under their care, providing him with first aid before preparing him for transportation to the hospital. It was difficult for me to look away from the stretcher carrying Ethan. My heart was filled with concern for his condition. It was several days before Ethan regained consciousness. His account of only remembering a strange sensation and the fog made me ponder many things. Local authorities and experts began investigating the incident, trying to understand how Ethan became involved in these events and what exactly led to such an outcome. Following the events, there were long and exhaustive inquiries into Ethan's role in these events. Questions of his guilt or innocence occupied the minds of many, from law enforcement agencies to ordinary citizens. People wanted to understand how an ordinary person could become the central figure in such an incredible story. The investigation tried to unravel the complex situation, gathering witness testimonies, analyzing all available evidence, and trying to link Ethan to the ancient legend of the Manitou. Supernatural experts and researchers from different parts of the country came to give their assessment of what was happening. While some saw Ethan as a victim of circumstances in the wrong place at the wrong time, others were convinced of his involvement in summoning entities from the otherworldly realm. Debates about whether Ethan possessed any unknown abilities or became an unwitting instrument in the hands of ancient forces raged on. Ethan himself, gradually recovering from his ordeal, found himself in the spotlight, trying to answer questions for which he himself could not find explanations. His life was turned upside down, and he felt the weight of others' expectations and suspicions. Ultimately, despite all the inquiries and debates, no compelling evidence of Ethan's guilt was found. The story involving him remained shrouded in mystery, and questions about what really happened that night remained unanswered. Over time, interest in the case waned, but for those who had faced the inexplicable firsthand, these events would forever serve as a reminder that the world is full of mysteries, answers to which we may never find.